206 cadets entered the Bastion Gauntlet the year I was assigned to it, and I wasn't one of them. My intake chit read, Auxiliary Render Maintenance, Tier 4, which was the Kethraeve Institute's polite way of saying I fixed the machine that other people got to be brave inside. I didn't mind it the way I was supposed to mind it. Before the Institute, before the transport that brought half my colony's engineering track out to Kethraeve Station on a 2-year exchange contract, I'd spent 6 years in a converted grain silo back home, rebuilding dead arcade cabinets, the real kind, cathode tube and coin slot, salvaged out of a shuttered rec center nobody wanted to demolish. You learn things fixing 30-year-old rendering hardware that nobody teaches in a classroom. You learn what a machine looks like when it's lying to you a half-second before it tells the truth. The gauntlet ran on principles that would have been familiar to me if anyone at Kethraeve had bothered to ask. It was a full immersion combat simulation, networked across 200 pods sunk into the floor of the deepest deck in the Institute, and it staged an elimination bracket every cycle. 1 round, 1 arena, 2 cadets in, 1 cadet out, all the way down from 206 to 1. The prize at the bottom was a single open commission slot in the Institute's forward tactical division. Everything else was theater built around that one seat. The theater was considerable. Sponsored cadets, mostly Cenovar, a species whose culture ran on a hard, visible logic I never got used to, arrived with neural lattice augmentation bought and installed by off-world combine houses looking to place a name in the record books. Cenovar biology made that arrangement almost unbearably legible. Their skull plating was translucent, and it brightened, cleanly and involuntarily, in proportion to active processing load. You could watch a Cenovar cadet's head go from dim amber to hard white light as they ran a combat calculation, and everyone around them could watch it too. Among their own people, that glow was a kind of currency. A dim skull meant low standing. A blazing one, bought or earned, meant you mattered. Threll Vosk mattered more than anyone in that bracket. He came in sponsored by a combine called Voraith Systems, carrying a lattice upgrade that put his skull at a permanent low simmer of white even at rest. And he cut through the early rounds the way water finds a drain. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Because half his decision-making had been offloaded to hardware faster than any human or unsponsored Cenovar reflex could match. Nobody in the first 150 rounds so much as marked him. My job was to keep the render pipeline alive underneath all of it. The Gauntlet's arenas were fully procedural. The sim didn't build a corridor until a cadet's pod telemetry said they were about to walk into one, and the hardware doing that building was 11 years old, and held together with the kind of patchwork only Tier 4 staff ever saw. I spent my shifts crawling the maintenance crawl space behind the pod bank with a diagnostic slate, listening to the rendering core the way I used to listen to a cabinet's power supply whine before it died, and mostly nobody noticed me at all. Which was fine. I wasn't there to be noticed. I was there because a translation error on an intake form had filed my 6 years of hands-on diagnostic work under the wrong department code, and by the time anyone caught it, reclassifying me would have meant admitting a mistake 3 tiers up, and nobody at Kethraeve was in a hurry to do that. I did my job. I ate in the maintenance mess, alone, and I read hardware logs for entertainment, which says more about me than I probably want it to. The other maintenance techs mostly left the Gauntlet's render core to itself once the brackets started, on the theory that a system running 200 simultaneous combat pods was better observed from a distance than crawled over mid-tournament. I never held to that theory. Old hardware doesn't care whether you're watching it during a quiet stretch or the middle of a championship. It fails the same way either way, usually at the worst possible moment, and I'd rather catch a failing capacitor at cycle 4 than at cycle 400 with a cadet's neural feed still hot inside it. So I kept my crawl space hours the same as always, slate in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, and I watched the bracket empty out the way you'd watch water drain from a tank you'd built yourself, slowly, and with a professional interest in exactly where the last of it went. Round 161 was the first time I saw the stutter. It was small, a frame-and-a-half hitch, gone before most eyes would register it, in a corridor arena that hadn't finished loading its far wall before the cadet inside it turned to look at it. I caught it on the diagnostic slate because I happened to be watching the render queue at exactly that moment, and because a stutter like that, in hardware that old, meant one of two things. Either the core was failing, which was my actual job to worry about, or the sim was doing something it wasn't supposed to be able to do, building the far end of a corridor, the exit, the actual shortest route through the arena, microseconds before it built anything in front of the cadet's own feet. I pulled the raw render order off 3 more rounds before I let myself believe it. It held every time. The Gauntlet's pathing engine wasn't waiting to see where a cadet went. It was solving the arena's shortest route the instant a round loaded, then rendering geometry outward from that solved path first, and everything else, the dead ends, the false turns, The decorative rubble the arena was supposed to be full of, filled in a half-beat later, like a photograph developing from the center out. That flicker, if you knew to read it, told you exactly which way a corridor actually opened before you'd taken a single step into it. It wasn't cheating, not in the sense the rulebook meant. It was a hardware artifact nobody had designed, and nobody was supposed to be able to see. I doubted anyone at Kethrave even knew it was there. I doubted anyone but a person who'd spent 6 years learning to read a dying CRT's refresh pattern the way you'd read a friend's face would have caught it at all. I went looking for the source of it the way I'd have gone looking for a dead solder joint, by process of elimination, not by guessing. I pulled the core's original build spec off the archive, 11 years old and badly scanned, and found the line I was looking for on the second read. The pathing engine had been designed, back before anyone thought 200 pods would ever run off the same core at once, to pre-compute a single valid route through any arena as a fallback in case live telemetry dropped mid-render. Nobody had ever needed the fallback. Nobody had ever turned it off either, because turning off a safety feature nobody remembered installing wasn't the kind of maintenance ticket anyone got promoted for filing. 11 years of nobody touching it, and the fallback had just kept quietly solving every arena first, a half-beat ahead of the geometry it was never supposed to be visible enough to leak through. I sat on that knowledge for 4 days. Mostly because I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. Filing it as a straight maintenance anomaly felt right, and also felt like it would vanish into a queue 300 tickets deep, unread until the next scheduled hardware audit, which was 11 months out. Sitting on it entirely felt worse, the longer I watched Vosk's bracket climb. On the 5th day, someone came and found me in the crawl space, which had never happened before. He wasn't Vosk. He introduced himself as a liaison for Vorayth Systems, human-shaped enough that I didn't clock what he was until he'd already sat down on an equipment crate across from me like we were old colleagues. He talked for a while about how impressed Vorayth was with junior technical staff who showed initiative, about how a commission-adjacent contract position might open up for someone who helped keep their sponsored cadets run. Clean, was the word he used, twice, through the remaining rounds. He never said the word stutter. He didn't have to. Somebody had noticed me watching the render queue a little too carefully. And Vorayth Systems didn't get to be Vorayth Systems by ignoring small things. He was good at his job, I'll say that for him. He didn't threaten anything, didn't so much as raise his voice. He talked instead about how much good work went unrecognized at an institute like Kethrave, how a person with my particular eye for hardware could spend a whole career 3 tiers down from where they belonged if nobody with real resources ever noticed them, and how Vorayth made a point of noticing people like that before their own institutions got around to it. It was, I understood later, a version of the same pitch Vorayth gave to every sponsored cadets family. Not a bribe exactly, just an early, generous accounting of what a person's silence might be worth to somebody who could afford to pay for it. I told him I'd think about it, mostly because I wanted him out of my crawl space, and he left a data chit with a contract number on it sitting on the equipment crate like I might change my mind between one breath and the next. I want to say I agonized over it. I didn't, really. I've spent enough years around machines that lie to know the difference between a fair fight and a rigged one, and I'd already watched 160 rounds of cadets, human, Senevar, 2 Kelvarathi exchange attendees who'd flown 3 months to get here, go up against Threl Vosk with nothing but their own reflexes, and lose to hardware they hadn't been offered a chance to buy. Handing him the one flaw the arena had left, quietly, for a contract number, would have meant I'd spent 6 years learning to see the truth in a dying machine so I could help one more lie get told. I filed it as a standard maintenance ticket instead. Render core anomaly, pathing artifact, priority, standard. I attached the raw frame data from all 4 rounds, wrote up exactly what was happening in language a board auditor could follow in under a minute, and copied it, not to Vosk's liaison, not to anyone at Vorayth, to the Bastion Arbitration Grid's own maintenance queue, the same queue every render anomaly in that facility was required to go through before the next round loaded. The grid did what it was built to do with a confirmed hardware artifact affecting fairness of competition. It patched it. Not for me, not for Vosk, not for anyone in particular. It applied a corrective render delay across every remaining round in the bracket, so the far-end geometry loaded exactly as slowly, and exactly as unreadably for every cadet left in the tournament, sponsored or not. I found out it had worked when Threl Vosk lost his first round 2 days later. I wasn't watching the match live. I was 3 decks down, chasing a coolant fault that had nothing to do with any of it. But I heard about it the way everyone in Tier 4 heard about everything, second-hand and a half-day late. His opponent was a Kelvarathi exchange cadet named Asin Threl, unsponsored, unaugmented, running on nothing but a good eye and steady hands, who took a wrong turn in the first 11 seconds, because the corridor didn't tell him anything he hadn't earned the right to know, and won anyway, 7 minutes later, because Vosk's lattice had spent the whole match compensating for information it could no longer front-load, and a Centaur skull running that hard, that long, at full corrective load, doesn't stay bright. It dims. Vosk's did, visibly, on the recorded feed, somewhere around the 4-minute mark, and every cadet who watched that footage afterward understood exactly what they were looking at, even if none of them knew why. The liaison found me again 3 days after that, in the mess this time, not the crawl space. He didn't sit down. He asked, in a voice with most of the warmth filed off it, whether I understood what I'd cost his cadet. I told him the truth, since it was easier than anything else I could have said. I told him I hadn't cost Vosk anything that was his to begin with. The corridor had always ended where it ended. I just stopped it from telling one cadet the answer before he asked the question. He left without the data chit. I never saw it again, and I never asked what happened to the contract number. Vosk himself came to the crawl space 2 weeks later, after he'd been eliminated properly, in a fair round. Against a human cadet nobody expected to make it past the semifinals. He didn't say much. Centaur don't apologize the way humans do. Their culture doesn't really carry the concept, from what I understand. Standing being too closely tied to demonstrated capacity to admit fault gracefully. But he stood in the doorway of my crawl space for a while, skull dim and steady in a way I hadn't seen on him before, and asked, eventually, whether I'd look at his lattice's calibration before he shipped back to Voraith's training deck. Said it had never run clean without the corridor telling it where to go, and he wanted to know before he went home whether that had been the lattice's fault or his own. I told him I'd take a look. I did. 2 days later, on my own time, because it turned out to be an interesting diagnostic problem and I'd never gotten to put my hands on a bought neural lattice before. It wasn't his fault. It had never been calibrated to run without the assist. Nobody at Voraith had thought it needed to be. I wrote that down for him plainly, the way I'd have written up a dying cabinet's fault report, and he took the slate without a word and left. By the final rounds, cadets I'd never spoken to had started finding their way down to the maintenance deck before their matches. Not many, and not with any ceremony, just 1 or 2 at a time, asking whether their pod's calibration looked right before they went in. I checked what they brought me. Most of it was fine, a few things weren't, and I fixed what I could and flagged what I couldn't, the same as I always had, except now people were actually reading the tickets. Nobody gave me a commission. I hadn't earned one under any bracket I was eligible for, and I wasn't sorry about that. The seat at the bottom of the gauntlet had never been what I was chasing. The reclassification request that finally corrected my intake code came through 11 months later, on schedule, exactly as slow as everything else at Kethrave, and by then it barely mattered. I was still down in the crawl space most cycles, still listening to 11-year-old hardware hum the way I used to listen to a coin-op power supply in a silo back home, and every so often a cadet would duck their head through the hatch before a round and ask me, straight out, whether the corridor they were about to walk into was telling them the truth. I always told them the same thing. I'd look, and then I'd tell them exactly what the machine was doing, and let them decide what to do with it themselves.